In the forgotten alleyways of the city, where the sounds of busy streets fade into the background, there lived a cat named Ember. Her fur was a deep shade of burnt copper, catching the rare sunlight that managed to break through the gaps between towering buildings. Her eyes, sharp and bright like polished emeralds, told a story of survival, of battles fought and won in the shadows of the city. Ember wasn't like the cats you'd see in warm homes, getting fed and pampered. No, Ember had lived her whole life in the streets, untamed and independent. The city had long since forgotten her kind, strays like her, who wandered between the cracks of human life, forced to fend for themselves. Every day was a challenge, and at every moment was a test of how far she could go to survive. She had learned early on that the world wasn't kind to strays. The city could be cruel, unforgiving, and dangerous. Food was never guaranteed. Shelter was just a fleeting luxury. But Ember had become an expert in finding both, always staying hidden when needed, always staying alert for the next danger, whether it was an animal or something else. This particular morning, like all others, Ember woke up in her small corner, nestled between two rusted dumpsters behind a rundown store. The air was thick with the scent of old food and stale smells, but it was home. The faint sounds of traffic hummed in the distance, a reminder that life existed beyond the alley, a life of warmth and comfort. But Ember had long stopped dreaming of those things. She knew better. She was a survivor, and survival was all that mattered. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the cracks in the alley, Ember's eyes fluttered open. She blinked, adjusting to the light. Hunger hit her hard, like a constant ache that couldn't be ignored. The alley around her was still, with only the soft chirp of birds overhead and the distant murmur of voices from the street. It was time to move. Her ears twitched as she heard the faint rumble of a passing car. The smell of freshly baked bread drifted from a bakery nearby, but Ember didn't dare approach. The bakery was always packed with people. It was too risky. Instead, she focused on what was most important: finding food. Ember knew every inch of this city. She had explored its back alleys, hidden spots, and forgotten corners. She knew where to find scraps, where to hide from bigger threats, and where to look for the occasional stray that might offer food. Today, like every other, she felt the gnawing hunger in her stomach. But Ember wasn't one to rush. Patience had kept her alive. As she moved through the alley, weaving between trash cans and discarded cardboard boxes, she caught an unfamiliar scent. It was faint, but unmistakable. A rat. Ember's heart beat faster. A rat meant food, but it also meant competition. She had to be quick. She crouched, muscles coiled, ready to pounce. The scent was stronger now, and she knew she was close. She moved silently, each step deliberate, each movement calculated. But just as she prepared to strike, a low growl echoed through the alley. The growl echoed louder, sending a wave of tension through Ember's body. Her fur bristled, and her eyes narrowed. She froze, her sharp ears swiveling toward the source of the sound. It was low, guttural, the unmistakable growl of a predator. Ember knew exactly what it was before she even saw it: a stray dog. From the shadows it appeared, a large, scruffy creature with wild, hungry eyes. Its fur was matted, and its teeth bared in a menacing snarl. The dog was much bigger than Ember, its body bulky and solid with strength. It was a beast of the streets, and just like Ember, it was used to fighting for survival. But unlike Ember, this dog had never learned the subtle art of stealth. It relied on force, on brute strength, and it was determined to take whatever it could. Ember's heart raced as the dog advanced, its growls growing louder, each step threatening. She had no time to hesitate. Her instincts kicked in. The rat, her food, was still just within reach, but the dog was too close, too dangerous. She had to choose: fight for the rat or fight for her life. In a split second, Ember made her decision. She wasn't ready to give up yet. She had survived too much already. With a swift movement, she darted to the side, narrowly avoiding the dog's snapping jaws. The dog lunged again, faster this time, its growl shaking the air. Ember's paws hit the ground with a soft thud, her body already moving as she dodged another strike. She twisted, using her agility to her advantage. The dog, heavy and slow in comparison, struggled to keep up. Ember could hear its frustrated growls, its paws slamming against the ground as it tried to corner her. The alleyway was small, cramped, with piles of garbage and discarded items everywhere. It was the perfect place for Ember to navigate, but the dog was too big to move with the same grace. Ember's movements were quick and fluid, a dance of survival. She leapt over a pile of old newspapers, barely avoiding the dog's snapping jaws, and kept moving, keeping just out of reach. But the dog was relentless, its eyes locked on her, its instincts driving it forward. Ember could hear the desperation in its growls. It was hungry, and it would stop at nothing to claim its prize. Ember's heart was pounding now, but she stayed focused. She couldn't afford to slip up. The alley was narrow, the space tight, and she had nowhere to go but forward. She had to outsmart the dog, outmaneuver it. She darted left, then right, twisting and turning with all the grace and speed that had kept her alive. The dog, determined and focused, kept up the chase, but its heavy paws were starting to slow it down. Ember could see the fatigue beginning to set in, the dog's breath coming in ragged gasps. She couldn't stop now. This was her chance. With one final burst of energy, Ember launched herself up a nearby pile of crates. She pushed off with all her strength, propelling herself into the air, her paws landing with perfect precision on a nearby ledge. Ember stood on the ledge, her breath steadying after the chase. The dog was gone, its barking fading into the distance as it gave up, defeated. Ember's heart still raced in her chest, but she allowed herself a moment to breathe. The city was quiet once again, save for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of wind through the empty alleyways. For a moment, everything seemed still, as if the world itself had paused to give her a brief respite. Ember's fur, still ruffled from the chase, slowly began to settle as she scanned her surroundings. The rooftop ledge she was perched on gave her a clear view of the alley and the surrounding area. It wasn't much, but it was enough to offer a sense of safety, at least for now. But peace was a luxury Ember couldn't afford. She had learned long ago that the streets never truly allowed for rest. As she surveyed the area, her sharp eyes caught something moving in the shadows below. She froze, her body tensing in an instant. Her instincts told her danger was near. In the distance, a figure emerged from the alley. Another predator, but this time, it wasn't a dog. Ember's eyes narrowed. It was a human. A man, scruffy and disheveled, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a worn-out jacket, shuffled down the street. Ember knew better than to trust humans. The city was full of them, and while some could be kind, others were a threat. They had a tendency to see strays as little more than pests, something to chase away, or worse, something to harm. Ember's ears flicked back, her body instinctively shrinking into the shadows. She knew it was only a matter of time before this man would pass by the alley. She had to move. Fast. With careful steps she turned, leaping off the ledge and landing softly on the ground. Her paws barely made a sound as she padded quietly across the alley floor, her eyes never leaving the man. She knew she had to stay hidden. If he saw her, she couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. Not after what had just happened with the dog. She moved with practiced stealth, her body low to the ground, her movements as fluid as water. The alley was full of hiding places, piles of garbage, abandoned crates, and empty cardboard boxes. Ember slipped between them, her sleek form disappearing into the shadows. As she navigated through the maze of debris, Ember's mind raced. She couldn't keep hiding forever. The human was still walking in her direction, his heavy boots pounding against the pavement with each step. She couldn't risk being cornered again. She needed to find food. She needed to keep moving, to keep surviving. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. Ember's pulse quickened, but she didn't panic. She had been in this situation before, and her survival depended on her ability to remain calm. She stayed perfectly still, listening intently for any sign that the man had noticed her. The streetlight above flickered, casting brief, harsh shadows on the ground. Ember's eyes darted between the light and the dark, searching for any way to escape. Then, just as the man approached the alley, he stopped. Ember's breath caught in her throat. Had he seen her? The man paused for a moment, as if sensing something. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes scanning the shadows. Ember held her breath, waiting. Time seemed to stretch, each second feeling like an eternity. And then, as if the world itself was playing a game of chance, the man turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the distance. Ember let out a quiet exhale, her body relaxing for the first time since the chase. She had survived. But Ember knew this moment of relief was fleeting. There would always be more threats, always more danger. But for now, she was safe. She could breathe again. As the man's footsteps faded into the distance, Ember didn't allow herself to relax for long. The hunger inside her was growing louder, a constant reminder that survival in the city wasn't just about escaping threats. It was about finding food, day after day. She couldn't ignore it. Her stomach growled, a deep gnawing sound that made her pause, ears flicking back in discomfort. It wasn't just a nuisance, it was a survival instinct, one that had been sharpened over the years, one that never allowed her to forget that hunger could be her downfall. Ember had to keep moving. She had to find something to eat, or she wouldn't last much longer. With swift, careful movements, she stepped out from her hiding spot and began to make her way down the alley. Her senses were on high alert, the sounds of the city creeping in around her. The distant hum of traffic, the occasional shouting of voices, the rattle of discarded cans. All of it blended into the background as Ember focused on what mattered, finding food. Her eyes scanned the alley, darting from one pile of garbage to the next. There was always something here, some discarded morsel left behind by humans who didn't care, or perhaps some creature too slow to escape the hunt. Ember didn't care what it was, as long as it filled her empty stomach. A soft breeze carried the scent of something familiar, something edible. Her ears perked up. She could smell it now, a faint scent of fish. Fish, a rare delicacy in the streets, was often discarded by the local market when it was past its prime. But for Ember, it didn't matter. A meal was a meal. She followed the scent, moving quickly, her body now focused entirely on the goal ahead. The alley narrowed further as she pushed forward, the scent growing stronger. She rounded a corner, and there it was, a pile of discarded fish guts behind a nearby seafood shop. It wasn't much, but it was enough to fill her stomach, enough to get her through the day. Ember hesitated for only a moment before she dove in, her sharp teeth working quickly to tear through the scraps. The fish was old, not as fresh as she would have liked, but it was food. She ate quickly, her body hungrily devouring every bit of what was left. There was no time to savor it, no time to enjoy the small victory. Hunger had no patience. As she finished, Ember licked her paws, trying to clean the remnants of fish from her fur. The feeling of fullness was temporary, and she knew it wouldn't last. But for now, it was enough. It gave her strength, the energy to move on, to keep surviving. But just as she was about to leave the area, she heard a noise. A rustling sound. Ember froze, her body tense, ready to flee at a moment's notice. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end as she turned her head toward the noise. Another growl. This time, it was different. It was a sound she had heard before, one that sent a chill down her spine. A larger animal, something she wasn't sure she could outrun. Ember's eyes widened as she spotted the source of the growl, a shadow looming at the entrance to the alley. It was a large, lean figure with glowing yellow eyes that locked onto hers with an unblinking stare. A wild cat, much larger than Ember and much more dangerous. This wasn't just any cat. This was a predator, one that ruled this part of the city, and it was now standing between Ember and her escape route. Ember's heart skipped a beat. Her first instinct was to fight, to stand her ground. But she knew better. This was a battle she couldn't win. With no time to waste, Ember did what she did best. She turned, running in the opposite direction, her paws pounding against the ground as she darted into the maze of the alleyways once again. The larger cat's growl echoed behind her, but Ember's speed was her advantage. She knew the city better than anyone. The sound of the wildcat's pursuit grew louder, but Ember pushed forward, weaving through narrow gaps and under fences. She wouldn't stop. Not now. She couldn't afford to lose her lead. Ember's heart raced as she sprinted through the alleyways, her paws slapping against the wet ground with urgency. The wildcat's growl echoed behind her, a constant reminder of the danger closing in. Every instinct within her screamed to run faster, to push her body to its limits. She couldn't afford to slow down. She had escaped death once today, and she couldn't risk being caught again. Her mind raced as she plotted her next move. The city was her playground, her territory. She knew every corner, every hiding spot, but this cat was faster than most predators she had encountered. It wasn't just an ordinary street cat, it was a hunter, built for survival. Ember's only hope was to outrun it, to lose it in the maze of alleyways and tight corners. But as she rounded a corner, she skidded to a halt. Her eyes widened as she saw what lay ahead, a dead end. A high brick wall loomed in front of her, its top lined with broken glass. There was no way out this way. The growl behind her grew louder, more menacing. Ember's pulse spiked. She had no choice. She had to find another way. She quickly glanced to her right and spotted a narrow gap between two buildings. It wasn't much, but it was a chance. Without hesitating, she darted toward the gap, squeezing her body through the narrow space, barely avoiding the sharp edges of metal scraps and broken glass. Her fur scraped against the rough surfaces, but she didn't slow down. She couldn't afford to. Behind her, the wild cat's growl turned into an angry snarl. The chase wasn't over. The cat had followed her into the narrow gap and was now just a few feet away, its claws clicking against the pavement. Ember's mind raced. She couldn't let it catch her. Not now. Her paws found purchase on the slippery ground as she pushed forward, her muscles straining with the effort. She had to find a way to shake it off, to lose it completely. Her instincts told her to keep moving, to never look back. She had no choice but to keep running. Up ahead, Ember spotted another opening, a broken wooden door leading into an old abandoned building. It was a long shot, but it was the only option. She lunged for it, her paws slamming into the door with a loud bang. The door creaked open just enough for her to slip through. She squeezed inside, the dim light of the building offering a brief moment of cover. The wildcat slammed into the door behind her, but it was too late. Ember was already inside, panting heavily as she pressed herself into the shadows. She could hear the wildcat's frustrated snarls from outside, its claws scraping against the door. But Ember didn't move. She had to stay quiet, to stay hidden. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Ember's breath slowed, her body trembling from the adrenaline. She wasn't safe yet. She knew that. The wildcat could still be waiting outside, its patience a deadly weapon. But for now, Ember was safe. She had outsmarted it, using the environment to her advantage. As she sat in the darkness of the abandoned building, Ember's thoughts turned inward. The hunger was still there, gnawing at her, but it was a background noise now. Her body was exhausted, but she had learned long ago that survival wasn't just about food. It was about finding the strength to keep moving, to keep fighting, no matter what. Ember's muscles ached from the run, her fur still damp from the chase, but she knew one thing: she had made it through another day. Ember leaned against the cool stone wall of the abandoned building, her breath steadying as she allowed herself a brief moment of relief. The wild cat was gone for now, its growls fading into the distance. The adrenaline of the chase was starting to ebb, and in its place, a deep exhaustion settled in. Her body ached, every muscle screaming for rest, but Ember knew better than to let her guard down for too long. She had survived another close call, but survival wasn't about luck, it was about constant vigilance, always being ready for the next threat. The building was dark, save for the faint slivers of light that filtered through cracks in the boarded-up windows. The air inside was stale, carrying the smell of mildew and decay. It wasn't ideal, but it was shelter, and that was more than she could say for most of the city. Ember's stomach growled again, louder this time. The food she had found earlier was barely enough to stave off the hunger, and the pain in her gut reminded her that finding a real meal was still a priority. But there was no easy way to get food here. She had learned to wait, to watch, to find the right moment to strike. The city offered food, but it wasn't given freely. One had to fight for every scrap, every morsel. With a sigh, Ember stretched her tired limbs, carefully stepping across the dusty floor as she looked for any sign of an exit. The building was large, filled with empty rooms and broken furniture, but it had a hidden advantage: quiet. No one came here. No one dared, but there were always risks. As she moved further into the shadows of the building, Ember's ears twitched. She could hear something faint, a sound that didn't belong. At first, it was just a whisper, something soft against the air. Then it grew louder. It was a low, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps, but slower, deliberate. Ember froze, her muscles tensing as her senses sharpened. The footsteps weren't human, she could tell that much. There was a strange, almost liquid quality to the sound, as if whoever or whatever was moving had no fear of being heard. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as the footsteps grew nearer. She crouched low to the ground, her body becoming a shadow as she sought cover behind a fallen piece of wood. Her eyes scanned the room, every movement a calculated risk. She had to stay hidden. If it was another predator, she wasn't ready for another fight. Not now. From around the corner, a figure emerged. It wasn't another cat, and it wasn't a dog. Ember's eyes widened as the creature stepped into the faint light, a massive rat. Its fur was matted and dirty, its red eyes gleaming with a strange, unblinking focus. It was unlike any rat Ember had ever seen, its body large and muscular, far too large for an ordinary rodent. It moved with purpose, its sharp teeth glinting in the low light as it sniffed the air. Ember's pulse quickened. This wasn't just any rat. This was a scavenger, a monster of the city's underbelly. And it wasn't just looking for food, it was hunting. For something, or someone. Her instincts screamed for her to move, to get out of sight before it noticed her presence. But Ember remained still, pressing herself into the shadows, her body barely moving. The rat's eyes flicked toward her hiding spot, and for a terrifying moment, Ember thought it had seen her. But the rat simply sniffed the air again, its nose twitching. It wasn't her scent it was after. The rat turned and began to move away, toward the other side of the building. Ember held her breath, not daring to move an inch. She waited until the rat was far enough away, until the sound of its claws on the concrete floor faded into the distance. When the danger passed, Ember allowed herself to breathe again, her body slowly relaxing. She had been lucky. But she knew she couldn't stay here for long. The city was full of creatures like that rat, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their next meal. And Ember wasn't going to be their next victim. Ember waited for what felt like an eternity, her body tense as she listened to the distant scurrying of the giant rat. The seconds stretched, and with each passing moment, her instincts screamed at her to leave the abandoned building. The danger wasn't over, but Ember knew one thing for certain. This city was full of surprises, and not all of them were as easy to outrun as the wild cat. The rat's footsteps faded away, leaving only silence in its wake. Ember slowly let out a breath she didn't know she was holding, but she didn't relax. Not yet. The city was vast, and dangers lurked around every corner, just beyond the reach of her senses. She could feel it. The tension in the air, the sense that at any moment, another predator or another danger could emerge. She crept toward the building's doorway, staying low, her eyes scanning the outside world. There was no sign of the wild cat, no sign of the rat. But that didn't mean she was safe. The city was always shifting, and those who survived learned to adapt, to change with it. The key was to always stay ahead of the game, to keep moving, and never ever get caught in the open. Ember slipped through the doorway, stepping into the alley that ran alongside the building. It was quieter out here, but it was a false sense of security. The streets were never truly quiet. There was always something, some sound in the background, footsteps, car engines, distant voices. It never stopped. The city was alive, and it never gave anyone a moment to rest. Her eyes darted to the far end of the alley. The night was falling, and darkness would soon cover the streets like a heavy blanket. Ember's fur bristled as she watched a figure pass by, a human carrying a bag of groceries. She didn't trust humans, but sometimes they left behind useful scraps. In fact, many times the trash bins near their homes were filled with food that they no longer wanted, food that was still good enough to eat. As she neared the edge of the alley, Ember paused, her ears twitching. She heard something else now, a soft whimper, followed by the faint sound of paws scratching at the ground. It was a sound that immediately caught her attention. A smaller animal in distress. Curious but cautious, Ember moved closer, following the sounds to their source. There, near a broken fence, she found a small kitten, no more than a few months old, its fur matted and dirty. Its eyes were wide with fear, and its tiny body trembled from the cold. Ember's heart softened, but only for a moment. The kitten was weak, hungry, and vulnerable. It was a reflection of the harshness of the world around them, another soul struggling to survive. Ember knew what it was like. She had been that helpless kitten once, struggling to find her place in a world that didn't care. But Ember wasn't the same as she had been. She had learned, she had fought, and now she had to make a choice. The kitten looked up at her, its eyes pleading for help. Ember's instincts told her to walk away, to leave the weak behind, to focus on her own survival. But as the kitten let out another soft mewl, something inside Ember shifted. She wasn't just a survivor. She was something more than that. She had the strength to protect, to help, even if it meant risking everything. With a determined step, Ember moved closer to the kitten. She nudged it gently with her nose, guiding it toward the safety of the alley's shadows. It didn't understand, but it trusted her. For a moment, Ember forgot about her own hunger, about her own fear. She focused only on the tiny creature in front of her. The city could be cruel, but Ember wasn't willing to let it be the end of this kitten's story. She had learned how to survive on her own, but now she would learn something new, something even more important. Ember stayed low, guiding the kitten through the shadows of the alley, her eyes darting back and forth. She could feel the weight of the kitten's tiny body against her, its trembling making her heart ache. She had no idea how long it had been out here on its own, but she knew one thing. Survival in the city wasn't easy, especially for something so small and vulnerable. As they moved deeper into the alley, Ember's senses were on high alert. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and her body tensed with every sound that reached her ears. The distant hum of a car, the faint rustling of trash in the wind. But there was something else, something far more menacing. A low growl rumbled from behind her, sending a chill down Ember's spine. She stopped in her tracks, her muscles coiled like a spring. Her ears perked up, and she quickly assessed the situation. The kitten, oblivious to the threat, continued to shuffle along beside her, unaware of the danger. Ember's eyes scanned the dark alley. There, just beyond the faint light spilling from a nearby street lamp, she saw the silhouette of another predator, a large dog, its fur matted and eyes gleaming with hunger. This wasn't a stray, it was a hunter, stalking its prey with the patience of a seasoned predator. The dog's growl grew louder, and Ember's instincts screamed at her to run. She couldn't outrun the dog, not with the kitten slowing her down. The alley was narrow, and the dog had the advantage in speed and strength, but Ember wasn't ready to give up. She couldn't, not now. The kitten looked up at her, its wide eyes filled with fear, its tiny body shaking even more than before. Ember glanced down at the little creature, her heart heavy. There was no time for hesitation. The dog was already moving toward them, its paws striking the ground with purpose. She needed to act fast. Ember didn't wait for the dog to close in. She made her decision instantly. With a sudden burst of speed, she darted toward a nearby dumpster, grabbing the kitten by the scruff of its neck with her teeth. The kitten yelped in surprise, but Ember didn't stop. She leapt onto the side of the dumpster, using it as leverage to propel herself to the top. The dog lunged, snapping its jaws just inches from Ember's tail. She barely avoided its teeth, landing on the top of the dumpster with the kitten safely in her mouth. The dog skidded to a halt below them, its growl turning into an angry bark. It circled the dumpster, looking for a way to reach them. Ember's heart raced, her body still trembling from the close call. She was high enough now to be out of the dog's reach, but the danger wasn't over. The dog continued to pace below, its eyes locked on them, its frustration growing. The kitten squirmed in her mouth, but Ember kept a firm grip. She had to think of a way to get out of this. The city was full of dangerous creatures, and every day was a battle for survival. But Ember wasn't just a survivor anymore. She had learned how to outsmart her enemies, how to use the environment to her advantage. Ember scanned the alley again, her eyes falling on a nearby fire escape ladder. It was old, rusty, but it looked sturdy enough. If she could make it there, she could climb to a safer vantage point and leave the dog behind. The dog barked again, louder this time, its frustration evident. Ember didn't waste another second. With a final glance at the angry predator below, she bounded off the dumpster and onto the fire escape ladder, her claws clicking against the metal. The dog's growls turned into furious barks, but it was too late. Ember reached the top of the ladder in seconds, the kitten still safe in her mouth. She quickly found a place to hide, out of sight of the dog, her heart still pounding in her chest. From the safety of the rooftop, Ember looked down at the dog, now circling below, still barking but no longer able to reach them. For a moment, everything was silent. The only sound was the distant hum of the city, the noise of the world moving on, oblivious to the fight for survival happening just below. Ember closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She had done it. She had protected the kitten, kept them both safe, but she knew this wasn't over. The city was full of threats, and no one was truly safe, not even at the top of a building. But for now, Ember had won. For now, they were safe. The rooftop was quiet, a temporary sanctuary from the dangers below. Ember and the kitten sat together in the relative safety of the dim light, their breathing slowly returning to normal. The city stretched out before them, a maze of shadows and distant lights. The vast expanse of rooftops seemed endless, but for now it was all they had, one small corner of the city where they could breathe, just for a moment. Ember kept her eyes on the kitten, who was now nestled into her fur, its tiny body still trembling from the encounter with the dog. The kitten's fur was matted with dirt, and its wide eyes still held the fear of the world around it. But there was something else in those eyes, something that mirrored Ember's own struggle, a desire to survive, to find a place where the dangers of the city couldn't reach them. Ember's heart softened, but she knew better than to let her guard down completely. She wasn't naive. She had been in this city long enough to know that peace was fleeting. It was never guaranteed, never permanent. There was always something lurking just beyond the horizon, waiting to challenge them, to push them further. But for now, Ember allowed herself to rest. She had earned it. Her body was sore, aching from the constant fight to survive, but her mind was sharp, always alert. She had learned that survival wasn't just about physical strength. It was about resilience, adaptability, and the will to keep going, no matter the odds. The kitten stirred in her paws, looking up at Ember with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. It was too young to understand the full scope of the world it was born into, but Ember could see the trust in its eyes. It had no one else, and Ember knew she couldn't just leave it behind. It was hers to protect now, whether she liked it or not. The silence stretched on, and for a brief moment, Ember allowed herself to close her eyes, to listen to the soft rhythm of the city below. The distant hum of traffic, the occasional shout from an alleyway, it was all part of the soundtrack of survival. Ember had come to accept it, to find comfort in the chaos. But as she sat there, her ears perked up, catching a faint sound, something different, something new. It was a low, grating noise, like the sound of something heavy scraping against metal. Ember's eyes snapped open, her muscles tensing immediately. She didn't move, didn't speak, just listened, waiting for the noise to repeat. It did. Again and again, the sound grew louder, and Ember could feel the shift in the air. Something was coming, something big. Her instincts kicked in, and she gently nudged the kitten closer to her side, making sure it was shielded from whatever danger approached. She moved cautiously to the edge of the rooftop, peering down to see what was making the noise. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw it, a group of large, mechanical scavengers. These weren't the small, nimble machines she had encountered before. These were hulking, metal beasts, designed for one purpose: to strip the city of anything useful. They moved slowly but deliberately, their metal claws scraping against the streets as they searched for anything they could steal or destroy. Ember's heart raced. She had heard rumors of these machines, but she had never seen one up close. They were dangerous, unrelenting, and they didn't care who or what they destroyed in the process. The city was full of them, machines designed to take and never give back. Ember didn't have time to think. She had to act, and fast. The machines were drawing closer, their massive forms casting long shadows as they advanced through the streets below. If they saw her, if they saw the kitten, it would be the end. With no time to waste, Ember scanned the rooftop for an escape route. She spotted a narrow alleyway just ahead, a gap between two buildings that would be difficult for the machines to fit through. It was their best chance. She quickly scooped up the kitten, holding it tightly against her chest. She didn't look back as she bolted across the rooftop, her legs moving faster than they had in days. The machines were closing in, their metal limbs scraping and clanking, but Ember was faster. She leapt across the gap, landing with a soft thud on the other side of the alley. The kitten mewed in her grip, But Ember didn't stop. She darted down the alley, her heart pounding as the sound of the machine's pursuit grew louder. They weren't far behind. Ember had no choice but to keep running. She had to keep moving, keep fighting. Survival wasn't just about outrunning the dangers, it was about finding ways to outsmart them, to keep ahead of the game, no matter how many obstacles the city threw her way. The city may have been a maze of dangers, but Ember was determined to navigate it. She had come too far to stop now, and as long as she had the kitten with her, she would fight for their survival, every step of the way. Ember's paws hit the ground with urgency, each step bringing her closer to the narrow alley she hoped would offer some kind of shelter. The sound of the mechanical scavengers grew louder, their heavy metal limbs scraping against the pavement as they closed in on the two of them. Ember's heart raced, her body aching from the strain of running, but she didn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close to safety. The kitten, still clutched tightly in her grip, mewed softly, its small body shaking with fear. Ember could feel its pulse against her fur, a constant reminder of the fragile life she was fighting to protect. She couldn't afford to fail, not after everything they had been through. The alley ahead was their only hope. It was cramped, littered with debris, but it offered the only escape route. Ember pushed herself harder, urging her tired legs to move faster. The machines were relentless, their pursuit unwavering. But Ember was determined. She couldn't let them take what she had fought so hard to protect. Just as she reached the entrance of the alley, she saw it, a steel grate blocking the way. It was meant to keep out unwanted intruders, but to Ember, it was another obstacle, another threat to their survival. The machines were close now, too close. She had seconds, maybe less. Ember didn't hesitate. She crouched low, pushing herself against the metal grate, trying to find a way through. Her claws scraped against the rough surface, her muscles straining with every movement. But the grate was too strong, too solid. Behind her, the scavengers' growls grew louder, their metallic feet clanging against the pavement. Ember could feel the heat of their presence, could almost hear the whirring of their gears as they prepared to strike. The kitten squirmed in her grip, its fear growing, but Ember refused to let go. She wouldn't give up. There was one last chance, one last move she could make. Ember scanned the alley again, her eyes falling on a nearby pile of abandoned crates. They were stacked high, but the top one was loose, partially torn. It was unstable, but it was her only option. With a quick decision, Ember grabbed the kitten and dashed toward the crates. She threw her body into the stack, her claws digging into the wood as she clambered up, carrying the kitten with her. The crates shifted, groaning under her weight, but she didn't stop. She had to get to the top. She had to get out of their reach. At the top, Ember paused for a moment, glancing down at the machines below. They had reached the entrance of the alley, their glowing eyes scanning for her. But the crates were too high. They couldn't follow her up here. Ember could hear their frustration, their growls echoing through the alley as they searched for another way in. The kitten let out a soft mewl in Ember's paws, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Ember allowed herself to breathe. She had done it. They were safe, for now. The machines paced below, their mechanical growls reverberating through the alley, but they could do nothing. Ember was high above them, hidden from their sight. The city was vast, and the dangers it held were endless, but for this one moment, Ember had outsmarted them. She had protected the kitten. She looked down at the small, trembling creature in her paws. It was still scared, still uncertain, but it was alive, and so was she. Together, they had made it this far, through every challenge the city had thrown at them. They had fought for survival, and they had won. Ember let out a soft, almost imperceptible purr as she nuzzled the kitten gently. The city may have been a dangerous place, but she wasn't alone anymore. They had each other. And for the first time in a long while, Ember allowed herself to feel something other than fear. Hope.